Hello, folks, and welcome to another scary story. Today, I'm going to be reading for you an absolute classic. It's very well known. You probably know it. The table is jiggling because the cat has now jumped up on it because he's looking at the little audio bar as it sort of jumps up with the sound of my voice. So if this is shaky, it's his fault, not mine, and there's no way for me to really keep him from getting up here. So, today I will be reading for you a short story, at least the first half of the story, of The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. And when you mention sort of Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories, this is really one of the first ones. Stop licking yourself, you're shaking everything. This is really one of the ones that comes to people's minds first, because you just settle down, just lay down. That's a good boy. This is one of the ones that everybody thinks of right away. It is incredibly popular. There's lots of different versions of this. You've maybe heard a version of this story. You might have seen a version of it on TV, in the movies. It's pretty well known. It's actually Jacobs, who was an English writer who died in the 1940s. The Monkey's Paw was written, I believe, in 1902. It's sort of funny because during his lifetime, he was actually best known for comedies and sort of only dabbled, I guess you would say, in sort of the horror and macabre genres, but The Monkey's Paw is probably his best known work now. So it's sort of funny how those things yes, get down, thank you. It's sort of funny how those things change around a little bit. So before I get into the actual story, I'm going to give the usual disclaimers. This is an antique story, and as such, may contain things about race, gender, sexuality, orientation, basically any of the sort of standard things where our attitudes have moved on, but what is in these texts has not and might be distasteful to modern ears. The other warning is, of course, that ghost stories and horror stories tend to feature not so nice things, murder, suicide. In the case of Lady Sannox, horrible disfigurement because your husband is a despicable human being. And as I have said in previous videos, if that doesn't sound like something you're interested in, feel free to just not consume this content. And I have a lovely piece of attractive red, dry, itchy skin right there on my neck. Yay, go me. Yeah, feel free to not consume the content. This might not be for you if that is the case. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, share. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who would love to hear some of these stories. And as always, if you have a suggestion for a future story, please do leave it in the comments section below. So here we go. We're going to get into the first half of The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of, and I've already got into the first word I might not pronounce correctly, so I do apologize. But in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." I don't know. Presumably chess people know what this means. I've never attempted to learn to play chess. It sounds very complicated. "I should hardly think that he'd come home tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live, this is the worst. Path's a bog and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter. We got some good old griping about road conditions, but like also you chose to live there, just putting that out there. Never mind, dear, said his wife soothingly. Perhaps you'll win the next one. Gotta stoke your husband's ego, I guess, like a child. Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. There he is, said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. Ooh, very fancy words. Sergeant Major Morris, he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. Yeah, have a drink. That's what I would do on a crappy, stormy night by the fire. Although I would drink gin, if I'm totally honest. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter. I'm hoping they're cutting the whiskey with the water there. I think that's the implication. After 3 glasses of whiskey, everybody went to the hospital with horrific alcohol poisoning. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter. Yeah, I fucking bet they did. And he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues in strange places. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look around a bit, you know. Gotta make sure India's still there, I guess. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and I don't know this word. The old temples and fakirs and jugglers. I have a vague feeling that might be a racist term. I apologize if it is, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the old soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. Again, I hope they're cutting the whiskey with the water. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. Meaning it's dried to the point of mummification, not that there's also a mummy involved in this. That would be weird. Although not so weird for the Victorians/Edwardians. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and, having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't we have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again, like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" "Yeah, guys, get up and help her, geez." Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "Yeah, let's mock somebody's pseudo PTSD response. That's nice." "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mrs. White dropped it, Mrs. White, Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned for his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful, pardon me. And the silly thing is this is actually quite easy reading. The language is not particularly archaic. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, just in time to catch the last train, we shan't make much of it. "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," said he, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." I think it's weird when parents call each other, like they have kids together and they call each other mom and dad. Like if I were to call my partner, if we had a kid and I called him dad or father, like that would be weird. You're not my dad. That's weird. I think that's weird when people do that. "Likely," said Herbert with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked." Yeah, how dare the wife express concern about the weird cursed object that their friend brought into their house. He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it. By clearing the house, they mean clearing the mortgage. So he wants to wish for the £200 to clear the balance of their mortgage. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. So he's playing his own theme music. I feel like that's going to come back to bite him. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. It moved, he cried with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. Challenge accepted, said the weird, cursed object, I bet. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me quite a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again, while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. Cat hair. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. So at this point, if this were a horror movie, you've clearly summoned a demon. Well done. Chapter 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun the next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose all old soldiers are the same, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Morris said the things happened so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I get back, said Herbert as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you. His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. Pardon me. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeants of Bilbius. I've been watching too much Hobbit. Nor prevent her from referring to... Apparently at the season change, my brain just short-circuits. Nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bilbless habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her and hurriedly unfastened the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. Yeah, it would not have been seen as proper for a woman to receive guests while in her working apron. It would be like you getting caught in the shower and like you don't want to go just wrapped in a towel, so you like throw on like a house coat or something. It's just about propriety. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. So her husband's also not in proper guest receiving attire. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit. Wow, okay, fuck you, W.W. Jacobs, for him to broach his business. But he was at first strangely silent. Yeah, because like when men are talking, they're exchanging news, but women are impatient and gossip and fuck you. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked up a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Ma and Megan's." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" So Ma and Megan's is probably the name of some kind of firm, business. Business. You will love business. It is the American way. Comment below if you understood that reference. Her husband interposed. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusion. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt," he said quietly. "But he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slow-witted husband, yeah, get your own back. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the windows, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." Yeah, your kid's dead. I imagine so. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. Ugh. Pardon the phone making noise. I thought I put that on silent. I did not. I will put it on silent now. There we go. Oh, who's texting me? What do you want? Anyway, where are we? Ba, 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 ba. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said without looking round. I beg that you will understand. I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Ma and Miggins disclaim all responsibility. Yeah, I fucking bet they do. In 1902. Safety rules? What are those? I was to say that Ma and Miggins disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit to no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at the visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped in a senseless heap to the floor. And that is where I will leave it for today. That was part 1 of The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. I hope you have enjoyed this. Thanks for choosing to hang out with me for a little bit. I hope you and your family are safe and well. And please join me here again soon for the second half of this